Good evening. As chair of the Central Scotland branch, I would like to welcome you all this evening to a presentation by Captain Adrian Scales, ably assisted by Yvonne Tung. Adrian's a Chartered Master Mariner. He's a fellow of the Nautical Institute, chair of the Northwest branch of the Nautical Institute, and director of Europe, Brookes Bell. Adrian joined Brookes Bell in 2007 from a position as master with P&O Ferries Irish Sea Limited. His particular specialisations are in areas which include salvage and wreck removal, ship handling, ro-ro vessels and cargoes. Adrian also specialises in the assessment of crew actions following emergency incidents, especially fire with respect to compliance with training and familiarisation on board ro-ro and general cargo vessels. In November 2015, Adrian was appointed to Lloyd's Salvage Arbitration Branch and Mediation Proceedings in the UK. And without further ado, Adrian, I'll pass over to you.
Thanks, Mark. And good evening all. And for those that have seen this before, I'm going to mix it up a little bit because Yvonne's going to take on all the scientist stuff with us as we go today. Contents, what are we going to do? We're going to run through 9 areas today, why we're here, construction, examples of thermal ray, vapor cloud explosions, which nobody really talks about. And then we're going to look at some specifics from a real case, real life incident from earlier in the year. And it will finish off with possible technological innovations and solutions that are being developed. So why are we here? If you look at the internet on any day at the moment, you will see there are accidents, incidents and fires involving lithium-ion batteries. And just looking at the ones we've got here, there's New Zealand, there's Australia, I think the top left from 2021. There you got the 2 on the right-hand side are 2023, and the 2 on the bottom, one from Kilwinning Battery Recycling Plant from April. In fact, the 8th, so 2 weeks ago. And again, more fires on stations, as you see, from early in March. So lithium-ion batteries are making the news a lot, and from what everybody says, they are a new and rising challenge in everybody's day's life. But what we will say from the outset is, at the moment, everybody's got a lithium-ion battery in their pocket, in their mobile phone or otherwise. So this isn't something that it's going to happen and be scared about. This is something to try and raise awareness of so everybody's aware what's going on. When it comes to shipping, there's 3 examples on the top of the screen there. The Estras Louisiana, this was a radio on the bridge that caught fire. Now, it's an interesting case with the lithium-ion failure on this one, is the bridge didn't actually have any fire detection system on board, and it wasn't manned because they were in port, so nobody knew there was a fire started as it happened on that one. Grande Costa di Vario, again, not confirmed what the fire was. This was a second-hand, and they say EVs and hybrids are involved. And the Fremantle Highway, which I will talk about in more detail as we move through. I'll now pass to Yvonne because she knows about the science a lot more than I do.
So let's talk a little bit about the construction of a battery. Everybody knows what a battery is. It exists in a lot of different forms: mobile phones, laptops, your handheld tools, a cordless vacuum. But let's just talk about a little bit basically about what it is, the construction of it and how it works. So the construction of a battery and the electrochemistry reaction inside a battery is actually fairly simple. They're deemed secondary batteries because it allows you to recharge them, which makes them a great option for convenience and portability. Here we have a schematic on the left of the key components in a battery. We've got the electrodes in the form of the anode and the cathode. These are electrical conductors in a battery which electrons flow through to create a current. We've got the electrolyte, which is a flammable solution, allowing the lithium ions to pass through. We've got a separator in place. This isolates the electrodes from touching one another. It's also microporous, so therefore the lithium ions can flow through from one electrode to the other. During discharge, basically when the battery is in use, lithium ions flow from the negative electrode, which is the anode, to the positive electrode, the cathode, whilst the electrons flow in an external circuit outside. when the cell is charging, the ions flow in the opposite direction. Everything is reversed. It goes from the cathode, the ions pass through, diffuses through the electrolyte, passes through these micropores in the separator, and it collects at the other electrode, depending on which way it's going, whether it's charging or discharging. There are 3 different types of batteries. It's cylindrical, pouch, and prismatic. So a battery is made up of, constructed of connected cells. These can be connected in series to boost the voltage or connected in parallel circuit to boost the current, depending on what it was. It can be a mixture of both. This comes together to form a battery module, along with other components built together. They also form a battery pack. I'll discuss a bit more about the other components that are required to form a battery pack in the next slide. So in the bottom left, you can see this is a battery pack. It's encased in possibly metal or other composites to give it a protective layer to the battery, just to prevent it from getting into any mechanical abuse, which again, I'll touch on a bit later. This is built into the chassis of the vehicle in this image here. It often comes alongside with a cooling system to help regulate the temperature, dissipate the heat of the battery to prevent it from going into a thermal abuse. Again, I'll touch on that a bit later. So the other components I was talking about, here are some of them. I just want to focus on the battery management system, the BMS, which is essentially the brain of the battery. This management system regulates and measures the voltage, the current, the resistance and temperature of the battery to make sure that it can perform to its optimal potential. And it also does this by monitoring the state of charge and the state of health of the battery. This is to ensure that the battery discharges and recharges at a good rate, a good level, to stop the battery from going into instability mode and into what we'll talk about later as thermal runaway. It keeps the battery stable. It prevents overcharging and over-discharging, which may lead to electrical abuse, which again, I'll go on a bit later. And thermal management, it keeps the battery cool, don't let it get too hot to run into thermal abuse. Some batteries are built with external communications in the form of telematics or telemetry data, which it feeds the data into a recorder to let you know what flaws the battery may have, which are not obvious to the naked eye. You know, you can't see it. It's just something that's going on inside. It reports back to you the health of the battery. Here also the enclosure is very important. As I mentioned, it gives support and a protective layer to the battery, but it also to prevent against mechanical abuse, but it also prevents any dirt or water ingress into the battery as well, to lead which may lead to instability in the battery later on. So here are different types of cathodes used by battery constructions in EVs. We've got LFP, which is lithium ferric phosphate. And this is commonly used in Tesla's normal range cars here. We've got the NCA, which is used in the long range Tesla cars here. This is a good comparison table for you to see some of the factors or properties that we look for in batteries. We look for the specific capacity, which basically tells you how much charge or energy a battery can hold. The more it can hold, the better, the longer it will last the battery between charges. Charging cycles is also very important for consumer reasons. You want a battery that has longevity, you know, not just replaced every 5 years or something like that. You want it to last as long as you can. Another thing to consider is safety performance. Here you can see the LFPs and the LMOs have good or excellent safety performance, whereas the NMCs and the NCAs less so, not as desirable. You may be thinking, well, why don't all EVs manufacturers use LFP? Well, again, as I mentioned before, the specific capacity comes into play. You want a vehicle that you can go as long as you can without having to charge. And this sometimes, it's a trade-off. You need to consider what it is that your consumer wants from the battery, what you want from the vehicle, and the price as well. Actually, the price is very important. As you see, the NCAs are significantly more pricey compared to the LFPs. So it's a decision the manufacturer's got to make with regards to cost, safety performance, and specific capacity. So what causes a lithium-ion battery fire? Lithium-ion batteries are a whole lot of power packed in itty-bitty space, really. And as I touched on before, there are different types of abuses. We've categorized them into 3 main types: mechanical, electrical, and thermal. Any of these abuse can lead to undesirable events. So let's touch on mechanical. Mechanical, as I mentioned before, is impact, basically. If a vehicle has gone on, been in a collision, or it's gone through anything from going through a really deep pothole or speed bumps or a collision or anything like that, can cause deformation into the internal components of the battery, rendering the battery unstable. Electrical abuse is basically overcharging or over discharging. The most common example I use for this is your phone. When your phone gets down to about 15%, it sends you a prompt to tell you you're losing battery, it's time to recharge. It sends you another one at 10, it sends you another one at 5. This is to prevent your battery from going into an over discharge mode, as over discharging or overcharging can result in dendrite growth within the battery. These dendrites are basically can cause internal damage to the separator inside your battery, rendering it an unstable battery again. So we've got another thing called thermal abuse, which is subjecting your battery to extreme temperatures, whether it's too hot or too cold. You'll also notice sometimes when you're charging your phone and you're using it at the same time, your battery gets very hot and it prompts a shutdown for you automatically. Or when you're in climates where the temperature is really hot, or you put your phone in your pocket, etc., it shuts down your phone automatically. This is the battery management system kit playing to reduce the temperature and keep your battery in a safe environment. So any of these abuses can result in a failure of the battery. Some batteries can fail with no warning, or with such a speed there is no time to react. We're talking a matter of milliseconds. And once it goes, it can lead to a phenomenon called thermal runaway. Thermal runaway is basically a self-sustaining reaction. It can be very difficult to stop once it is started. So the initial abuse, so whether that be mechanical, thermal, or electrical, can result in an exothermic, undesirable exothermic reaction within the battery, which means heat is generated. We start this endless cycle, what seems like an endless cycle of heat being generated, temperature rise, and leads to increased reaction rate. As a rule of thumb in science, they say for every 10%, for every 10 degrees rise in temperature, we double the rate of reaction. So here you can see as the rate of reaction is increased, we have more heat generation, we have this cycle of going around and around and around, and it becomes very difficult to stop once it starts. It's very rapid. The temperature can rise in a matter of seconds. It can rise to about 400 degrees. Energy stored in that battery is released very suddenly. The fire can be so hot it's almost impossible to extinguish. And during the process, it can release toxic gases in the form of a vapor cloud. Some of these gases, I've listed some of these gases here. Some of them are explosive hydrogen, for example. Carbon monoxide is toxic. Some of them are corrosive. Some of them, you don't, once administered into the system, you're breathing it in, for example, you don't notice the health effects it has on you immediately, but it becomes very apparent later on and very lethal or fatal in some cases after ingesting some or breathing in some of these chemicals. You'll see they've got a detrimental effect on the body. So this releases in the form of a white vapor cloud. It's also important to note a cloud can produce up to 600 litres of vapor from a 1 kilowatt battery. 6,000, what did I say?
600.
Sorry, 6,000. In 2022 car models, they have around about 21 to 108 kilowatt per hour battery. So that is over 600,000 litres of vapor cloud collecting from that one from that car EV. So to put into perspective how quickly thermal runaway is, I've got some clips here to show you. So here we've got a father-daughter sitting down watching TV charging a scooter. That bang is the failure of the battery. Father goes to unplug. And we've got a vapor cloud. It doesn't take long. It takes 7 seconds for the battery to fail until the room is filled with toxic vapors. And hydrogen, as we said, is flammable. From the reaction, it can result in flames. Here we've got another one. Motorcycles parked in a car park. The batteries failed. You see this eerie mist on the floor collecting. This is because some of the gases are more denser than air, so it's collecting on the ground here. So the normal firefighting advice of you staying low to the ground during a fire, might not be the best advice in a lithium-ion battery fire. Again, we have another electrical bus incident here that happened a couple of years ago in Paris. The battery is installed in the roof of the bus. In this case, we've got like a rain cloud of molten metal. It's so hot. All that's raining down is molten metal at the moment. As I said in the previous slide, you will have noticed that the battery was built in the chassis of the vehicle there. If you can imagine, it's quite easy to access the fire here because it's on the roof maybe, but if built into the chassis of the vehicle, if the vehicle built around it, it'll be quite difficult for fire extinguishing operations.
You can imagine that on the car deck of a Ro-Ro, which is where you look at it, how quickly the space will be filled with fumes and heat, temperature. Phenomenal.
So I've got some examples of unconfined vapor cloud explosions here as well. Here we can see a gentleman just getting his laundry, unaware that he's narrowly missed death. We've got the tumble dryer running like we've got a big explosion. I mean, how many times have you put a load on, washing on, not checking the pockets? You know, it's quite easy these days. You leave a vape or you leave your earphones in there, your mobile phone or a portable battery. Here we have a hybrid Jeep explosion. Parked in the garage. It's so strong, it's blowing the doors right off and across the driveway. The firefighter had just sustained minor head injuries, but nothing drastic. What initially caught their attention was smoke was seen coming out of the garage, so he went to inspect, not aware of what's going on inside. And I pass this over to Adrian.
Okay, so what we're looking at here is in the last few years, there's been a number of major Ro-Ro fire incidents with some fatalities, but major losses. And statistics from the P&I insurers are 1 in 5, 15 to 20% of all Ro-Ro, RoPax, PCT, TC fires result in the vessels becoming either a CTL or a total loss. Felicity is a good example. She's a total loss because she's at the bottom of the sea now. But the Fremantle Highway, obviously, we've saved that. But when you get a fire on board these ships, they're exceptionally difficult to respond to. And the reason for that, and anybody that's on a Ro-Ro will appreciate this, is that you've effectively got an oven space. Because where you've got a conventional bulk carrier container ship, you have holds with openings. You can put water in from the top, potentially flood the space to deal with it. With a Ro-Ro, it's all horizontal. So you've basically got canopies above canopies with A60s between them. And when you bring that into context, it means that you can't put water on the top for it to go down into the ship because you can't get to the fire. So the fire is contained in the space. And I'll show you a video of that shortly. But it also means that access is very difficult. So for a ship like this, your access may be a stairwell forward, stairwell midships, stairwell aft, and trying to actually access anything on the decks during the event of an incident, it's very difficult. One key point here from statistics, crews will take on average 8 to 12 minutes to muster before they can go and fight their fire on their ship. These incidences will happen in seconds. And 8 to 12 minutes down the line, you could have already finished your fixed firefighting systems on board the ship. So for us, the key thing here is about go first. And with most of these ships, and this is a statement that I saw the other day, you don't pour water on the roof of your house if the kitchen is on fire. That's what you're talking about most times with a Ro-Ro ship. You're putting water on the outside and hoping it's going to get to a ship. It's exactly the same with the car. The battery is protected on the bottom. You put water over the top of it, you're not getting to the seat of the fire. You're not making any changes. This is my old ship. This, I believe, is either the Highlander or the Corsair. It's the Highlander because of the lift. But you've got to look at it in the context. I look at this purely and simply from seafarer's perspective. So, self-contained breathing apparatus, 20 minutes of air with a 200 bar bottle, if you're lucky. If you're not stressed, in which case that working duration goes down. And I've seen people put a BA set on and go through a bottle in less than 3 minutes because they're hyperventilating and drawing the axes in. But if that car deck is full, how long will it take you to get from a stairwell to a point on that car deck? And it's likely to be 5 to 6 to 7 minutes if you're lucky. And that's where the challenges come. It's not going to be a straight line. So if you look at the right-hand side of the left image, look at the trucks tucked together side by side. You may have to do a Jenga to walk down the deck to get to where you need to be. The bottom right-hand picture, plenty of cars think about some of those images with the smoke and the fumes that have come through. How would you identify where that fire was on that car deck in order to put your drenchers on? Because one of the things we talk about with drenchers is the drencher fire pump is generally good for 2, sometimes 3 zones, and you might have 11 zones. So if you don't know which zone you're in, you put it in the wrong one, you've actually not used your fire system to the right place. And when you look at this image here, again, that is the European Causeway, my last vulture. Look where the lifeboats are. The lifeboats are toward after the deck. So if you've got a vapor cloud or you've got a fire on that deck, you're going to be hopefully venting your vapor cloud through this area. But you've now got to consider, the master and the crew have got to consider, what direction do you take so that the fumes and the smoke is going away from the lifeboats if you want to try and abandon ship, or from the MES systems. And it's just things to think about. What we're trying to say is look and see what it is. And you can't get to a specific location of where they go. But again, consider also, if you've got a big fire, are you going to get a shifter cargo? Because some of these cars, if you have a fire in them, they may start moving themselves about. Short circuit could cause these vehicles to also move. And your petrol cars, the worst case scenario we see it is a petrol car parked next to a electric vehicle, because I'm hearing now that a lot of the fuel tanks on these cars are plastic, and you get a jet flame at 1200 degrees, then you've suddenly got the energy from petrol as well. You've got a lot more of a challenge. But again, it's looking to how you do, and do you park them?
Scary example from last summer. A Volkswagen ID3, one of the small ones, elder lady boarded and couldn't get her electric window back up, and inadvertently engaged drive again.
Yeah.
And the torque in this diddy little ID3, same size as a Golf, went into the back of another Golf that drove it forward into the back of another Golf that drove it forward into a Mercedes little A thing, whatever it is, that drove it forward into the back of a Prius. So one car ended up moved 5. Yeah,
Unbelievable.
The torque is unbelievable. So if you're saying about the short circuiting,
it could do that as well.
Yeah,
and it can seal people up as well. So this is it, and this is where it comes into it. Your drenchers, great, but do you get the right zone straight away? Because if you get the wrong zone straight away, you can have a problem. If you've only got 2 zones of fire you can put on to try and contain it and cool it down. I do honestly believe drenches are the best protection on the ship in these circumstances, because it's giving you protection for the deck above, it's giving you cooling for the deck below. You've got to watch your stability, you've got to watch everything else. But if you know where the fire is and you can detect where the fire is from the outset of an incident starting and get the drenches on straight away, you can get a bit of protection for the people above and the car decks below. And you may buy yourself time in order to put a better response together. But if you leave it 2-3 minutes, it could be a problem. These images, I always like the scaremongering images, but this was the Euroferry Olympia from 2022 that I attended. This is worst case scenario. Now, we don't believe there was a EV on this ship. There would have been batteries involved, but this was a case where the stern door was open, the air got back into a little fire somewhere on the deck that we couldn't get to. And when I talk about the stairwells and access to a car deck and where do you get in, where do you get out, the key point there is 3 stairwells, 1 forward, half one. As a salvo with a BA set on, they've only got maybe 30 minutes of air because they've got 300-litre bottles, or they've got double X. They couldn't get round the whole car decks either in order to make sure everything was completely clear, and you were going on gases and the gases were indicating everything was all right. Once you're lowering 120 ton, 130 ton stern door down, you're not going it back up again. And therefore, this is an example. This was a video I took stood on the ramp 20 minutes after the stern door opened, and that fire was raging. And that fire, that's your oven space. Your fire is
panels there are just
and that panel is bowed because the temperature at the top of the headspace is 1500 degrees, and anything in that way is just getting vented off. Now, as a firefighting thing, from anybody on a Ro-Ro thinking about this, we nearly lost 3 salvage firefighters. When the fire was through the forward part of the deck, they're in fighting the fire at the seat of the fire, rigging hoses and trying to put some boundary cordon to try and take the temperature out of it. And the local fire brigade came in and put some little fires out at the door space. And I never thought of it before, but wanted to think about now. If you put water on that, the main fire at the back of the deck is drawing all its air in to combust. and you put water on the fires at the door space, that turns to steam, and now you're scalding, because all that happens is that steam then runs into the base of the fire where your firefighters are, and we cooked the firefighters in that. They were led on flat on the deck until it had cleared, because they didn't understand, the fire teams didn't understand what was going on. And that after stern ramp, I'll just give a little bit, I don't want to go too long on this, but the local guy in Greece, who was the court appointed surveyor, turned up in trainers, and he stood on that ramp and had a row with me, and I told him to get off. What's the problem? And I said, look at your trainers, and his boots, his trainers were melting to the ramp. So yeah, you got to be careful. PCTC's exactly the same, longitudinal decks, big challenge. But when we talk about the Fremantle Highway now, on that ship, so deck 5 is your longitudinal freeboard deck, and you can just about see it just above where the propeller is. That's your longitudinal deck. Everything above was one fire zone. Everything below was one fire zone. So if you have a fire in any of those decks, it's communal. And how do you get to any vehicle on this deck in a hurry? Because they're not all in a straight line, therefore you can't walk in a straight line. You've got your small lashings, maybe a bit of a challenge if things start failing or moving about. And headroom. This is a decent ship with about 2.2 meters of headroom. Fremantle, on the decks, there were 1.8. I was having to duck with my helmet on under all the frames because of the space, maximising it. So that's another big challenge. And again, these photographs I've taken here, they look great photographs. So I appreciate that they're looking pretty good. But when you've had a fire, the ship is dead. So these are photographs all taken with a head torch, a hand torch, and a flash on your pocket camera to show what's left. But if you haven't got those tools, you can't actually see a thing. That is a dead ship. And these string lights are perfect. And I would actually recommend having in a fire kit on a ship, some of these 150 meter long string lights, because in an emergency, if everything else goes dead, you can actually have a little generator, plug this in and run a buddy escape route for anybody that's doing it. And this is what the salvage firefighters would use. Basic firefighting, fire blankets, we've said before, and I'll say it again, in this location, they are perfect. If there's plenty of space around the vehicle, they will work a treat. They will not work on a car deck of a ship if the fire is already going, because you will not get close enough to the fire and be able to get the blanket over the vehicle so you can bring it into control. Fire service, they talk about sticking it in a skip, put the fire out, contain it and everything else. Not an option on a ship or an enclosed car park. And if you read the Tesla manual, Tesla does not recommend placing the vehicle in a large container full of water, does not recommend the use of foam, and during all firefighting activities, consider the vehicle energized, always wear full PPE, including SCBA, self-contained, and that's in the Tesla manual you can download offline now. So they're telling you how dangerous this is in their manual, what you're actually fighting. And I think that's a key point to think about, is even the manufacturers know if there's something going on with a fire on these things, it can be a real challenge. We talked about it earlier in the room, but the respirators, I think, is essential now. The kit that you have on board, you should have something that if you've got something venting with gases, you've got to protect the crew's lungs and their eyes. And I'm not talking about fighting fires. This is purely evacuation and or side movements. Current fixed firefighting systems, water, great calling. The deluge, I think, is a system. CO2 will not put the fire out, but anybody that knows how CO2 works, if you've got a CO2 space and the fire's in that, what it might do is stop, provided you get your 30% by volume, may stop other things burning. Therefore, again, it's about containment. Let the things happen what they're doing. High expansion foam, I'm going to talk about that very shortly, because high expansion foam works to a point, but the key point with high expansion foam is it may suppress the flames, but it will not stop the gases. And then the gases, if you put foam in, the gases have got no ignition source, so they could build in large volumes. And then when you ignite a large volume, you have a much bigger problem. So actually foam may be a problem. We still don't know yet. We're still looking through that. Fremantle Highway, going to talk about this. This is my pet soapbox again. This was a case last July. I was appointed as SCR. If you look at the top left image, the top of that car deck is set up a curvature. It's supposed to be flat. This has been set up 2.5 meters over 100 meters of length of that deck. If you look in the bottom right image, if you see where the funnel is right in the bottom of that image, that's your main fire main running across that canopy deck on the top of the ship. And when it blew and the deck blew up, that fire main was breached.
Right.
And therefore the crew had no water in order to fight the fire. And if you look where the flames are on the top left again, look where the lifeboat is and the crew's accommodation, the crew couldn't get back to the lifeboats because of the fire and the fumes, and therefore couldn't actually abandon ship. That to me is a bit of a design flaw in the system, but the crew again were not made aware there was a potential for a vapor cloud explosion. And if you don't know there's a potential, how do you react to it? And if they'd known, perhaps they could have started venting or put vents in place. This is the underside of that image, showing you the canopy deck set up. And again, there's the cars, it's all sat there, but look how that deck space is now bowed and set up from that explosion. And we estimate somewhere between 1 million and 1.5 million litres of hydrogen in that headspace to have caused that extent of damage in that. And then the question then comes is, where did that 1 million, 1.5 million litres of hydrogen come from? But if you think about 600,000 litres potentially from a 100 kilowatt car, there's a slight issue with that, because if you talk to some manufacturers, they'll say that there's 11 battery modules in a full electric type car, similar to that. And maybe 2/3 will have vented and maybe 1/3 is still live. So you maybe need a dozen or 40 or 30 or whatever it is vehicles to contribute. And this is where the foam suppression system may have contributed, because with the foam, you don't get the jets, and therefore you don't get the ignition point. And if you've got the ignition point, you don't get the cloud developed. Once the cloud's gone, it's gone, bar the fumes that remain in. Very difficult. I would say anybody that's got a Mini, the Minis are always good because you can still tell what the Minis are, but the other vehicles in the deck there, a lot of them vaporized. And I say that quite genuinely. There were vehicles in this space there, we never worked out what they were. And to this day, they are still looking for the Lamborghinis that were on board. Never actually found them. So there is a bit of an issue. But again, when you look at the outside of that ship, yeah, it's burnt, but what you don't see is the devastation inside, of where the decks are distorted and the temperatures have gone through and everything's dropped. So yeah, the external shell looks all right, but internally you can't move about. And again, you think about this from a context of safety evacuation, safety zones. Where do you go? How do you move? Very difficult. These cars, this is an electric vehicle, full electric vehicle. My inspection on board, looking at it, I could see normal electrical sockets and rubber pipes that hadn't burnt, but the car's burnt out. So therefore this is a full EV, but it's burnt out. So there's no battery management system, but the batteries hadn't been in thermal runaway, but they appeared to be bricks. So in a salvage situation, the manufacturers that we spoke to advised us to remove them off the ship because they couldn't confirm it was safe or not. When you're looking at the heavy metals and the toxics involved, that's the next slide. Hang on, I'm just going to run on quickly. These are the toxins that were measured. So the heavy metals, pH values from the water that was on the car deck and on any surface you touched within the deck. So these are what you will find on those surfaces. So if I would say anybody that's had a fire, don't assume you can walk straight back in, because the surfaces are likely to be covered in the metals and the heavy metals and everything in there. I'll just run back to this slide. These are the stalagmites I mentioned earlier. So most cars, aluminium to reduce the weight. Battery compartments for the batteries like to be aluminium as well. The batteries themselves may contain aluminium casings, but when they melt, and this is an example where they melt, the flow on pure aluminium is about 660 degrees, they say, around that figure. But to get it flowing from 5 or 6 decks to get to where we were on here, the guesstimations that we're hearing from experts in this field is 1200 degrees minimum to have got the flow, because this is the main deck. This is below the main fire zone. So you've now got a transfer of heat and you've got a transfer of aluminium. This young fellow on the right hand side there, that's one of the larger ones we found, 0.5 meter diameter when you're looking at a stalagmite on the main deck. So that's flowed from above and ended up, and you can see where they are. So they're below all the lashing holes on the deck as you work through. Open stairwells, so the crew couldn't have got any lower if they'd wanted to, which I don't think this is a great idea. But if there's a fire in any of that upper deck, you couldn't have got any lower on board because there were open stairwells. Toxins we talked about. This is a full EV, and the battery, as you can see, hasn't been in thermal runaway. It's still a solid unit, but they could not say whether it was live or not because there's no battery management system. It took 3 months to dismantle that battery from that chassis in a recycling yard in order to take the batteries to try and recycle them. And from where we were, the only recycling plant was back in Germany. And it was 3 months to run it through. Again, just seeing the things in there, the floods in Dubai at the moment, which are with the rainstorms and everything. Luckily, it's fresh water, not salt water. But we had, I think it was 6 cars on this ship in a fire zone where the water had got above the floor plate level. And I was always told there's not a problem with that because these cars are designed to go through puddles. This car caught fire as we brought it off the ship. And we brought it off on doilies, put it on the ramp, and as soon as it went on the ramp, it was inclined to about 6 degrees or whatever the ramp was at. It went bang, and the flames were produced from the bottom of the car. And we went through all the things, and this caught fire purely because it'd been submerged in seawater. So our record is 1 in 6 catches fire if they're submerged in water. And we've seen that in the States. We'll probably see some examples of that in Dubai in the coming weeks. We put this up, I should say, we put it in a skip. The skip was empty when we put it in the skip, and within 10 minutes, it went back into full thermal runaway with the gases producing. So we flooded that skip and put a fire blanket over the top of it. And you're supposed to leave it for something like, let's say 48 hours, or minimum 6 days. We left it for 48 hours because we had a fire team monitoring all the time. But again, the fumes and the gases were still bubbling. And there are videos online where Teslas have been pulling boats out of the water and got dragged back in with the boat. And they will burn underwater quite happily, some of these battery packs, which is a bit of an issue.
So, I mean, lithium-ion batteries, they're always looking at, manufacturers are always looking at ways of improving the battery's life, duration between charge, performance, safety, etc., etc. Here are a few of the research directions they're looking at the moment. So they're thinking of modifying the electrolyte, making it a non-flammable electrolyte. Also, potentially some solid polymer electrolytes, which basically acts like a gel, blocks these pores in the separator to prevent the ions from traveling from one end to the other, from one electrode to the other, basically hindering, stopping the reaction as best as they can. Other things that they're currently looking at are modification of other battery components, such as the separator. What if they make that thinner? Can we get more use out of the battery? Or electrode coatings? Is there a way to make it safer? And the battery pack, the other components for the battery packs, as I mentioned earlier, like the cooling system, for example, can we get a better venting system, cooling, keeping the battery at a good temperature away from thermal abuse, pressure relief, self-isolation. So if one cell goes into thermal runaway, can we prevent it from propagating to the other neighboring cells beside it? And detection. There are some companies that are looking at making up devices that claim to have an early onset detection of the off-gassing coming from batteries just prior to it going into thermal runaway. Some of these claim that they can value up to about 13 minutes, but there's a lot of research going into that at the moment.
I see sodium ion. That's the next generation. Is that going to be potentially sort of lesser risk in comparison?
Potentially.
Right.
That's the answer, is potentially. Everything on this is potentially.
Mhm.
And I think just looking at the ship design, a lot of people are looking at this now. Where do you stow them? How do you put them? What do you do with them? But from seafarers around the room, and when you talk about sensibility here, we're all used to being on ships where the ships are designed to go from A to B, and then known that you're going to roll, you're going to pitch, you're going to have adverse weather that's going to cause you to corkscrew, and everything on board is designed, it's marinized, as they would call it, to ensure it's fit for purpose at sea. It doesn't fall to bits. What we've got to take into consideration is when you're looking at battery energy storage systems on for fields where you've got your windmills, or where you've got your solar panels and everything else, they're designed for a static position where they're checked and maintained. But they're now carrying them on a ship. As Yvonne will tell you, she spent a lovely 6 weeks or so over in Alaska, where these battery energy storage systems have been put on a ship, 192 of them, and carried between Asia and we're going to the States. But they weren't really marinized for carriage. They were designed to go in a field and stand by a unit. But the ship's rolling and they're lashed, and anything's possible. because the manufacturer doesn't expect and doesn't think about how the shipping side of things will potentially affect it. And we've got to be careful of this. This is one of the things to keep thinking it through, because you could be carrying these on ro-ros, you could be carrying the things. And the Tesla full battery energy storage system of the Tesla, which is a one we've got a lot of information on, they say do not incline it more than 5 degrees. And they're lowering them on bulk carriers.
Mm.
Well, I've never seen a bulk carrier roll more than 5 degrees in my life. I mean, never seen it roll less than 5 degrees, really, to be honest, but let's go. So what we're seeing is ships now being designed. Now, this is a good image, and I like this image. What we've got here is where the cars have been loaded, where they're going on ships. But throw a spanner in the works, as I always like to do with these. When you think about a PCTC with a stern ramp could be 160, 170 tons, it can take anywhere between 20 and 40 minutes to close it in an emergency. If you've got a CO2 fixed extinguishing system on your ship, you're waiting 20 to 40 minutes if you can get to the controls before you can actually use it. Therefore, your fixed firefighting when you're in port may well be a challenge. That is something to consider. And we're looking at, I spoke to somebody recently about, could you install a fire blanket across the stern door in an emergency, drop it down, still use your CO2 if that's what you're firefighting mean on a PCTC. And then I spoke to a fire curtain manufacturer, and the only test rig in the UK for fire curtains is 3 meters by 3 meters. They don't do anything big enough because you've got, again, it's got to be certified to be able to seal the space.
Yeah, it's like
there's nowhere that makes them yet. So again, thinking these things through. There is a lot of technology. There are a lot of people trying to come up with the high fog systems. One tried to use it on the Fremantle Highway, but when we said, well, where's the water coming from? And we want to put sodium, where's the pump coming from? Well, we need to put this pump and we need to put all this water on the upper deck of that ship. Well, how are you going to get it on board? Come on, it's just 22 meters in the air, and there's not a lot of cranes that will reach up there. F500 encapsulant technology is very, very good, provided you can get it into the battery. It basically absorbs everything and will stall the reaction. But batteries are sealed to stop the water getting in. So you're trying to get hydrogen is probably the best one. Novatech 1230 again. So there's a lot of people coming through and coming up with designs and proposals, but we still are in that learning phase. We haven't had these cars long enough to really understand how quickly it will go, what causes it to really go. We know the main areas, but you'll find there are cars that will just go poof because the separator or the what do you call them, the dietrites, whatever it is, can cause these things to just fail, or electrical closed circuit connections. This Gurpreet and his team have developed, and this is based on the 6,000 litres per minute evolvement out of a battery in a standard space. How quickly that space, and again, this is what was the decade height on this one? Do we have a decade height in that? Was it 2 meters or was it less?
Should be like something like 2 point something meters.
Yeah, but look how quickly that's going. So if you're thinking about cameras on your car deck to try and identify where the fire is, you're going to be pretty much stuffed fairly quickly. And this is purely the vapor cloud. There is no fire here. This is just a vapor cloud venting in the space, and how quickly you lose visibility. And again, this is real time. This is 40 seconds into one of these batteries failing. Mm-hmm. So if you're talking 8 to 12 minutes to muster your crew, by that time that deck could be full. But you've got to then think about how do you get that gas out in order to do the next one.
I think that's not considered here is the thermal effects that will also increase the rate at which the gas will flow out.
Yeah. And we've got to educate the public. This is a photograph from my office in Liverpool. This was a lawyer's Tesla, and I shouted because I disconnected it and unplugged his car. And he said, well, I can't get over. Well, it wasn't bothering me. But if you look at this, was a B&Q extension lead running across the main drive-through fare of the car park. So everybody's driving over his cable. But you've got the drain grid, the metal drain grid with the hatch on the top. And it's a couple of inches away from it. And each car went over it, was putting it closer. Yeah. What we don't know is if you short-circuit that cable, would it cause the car to have a problem? We don't know, but why would you even take the risk? And so now he parks it reversing and it plugs on the sidewall. And I love this. This is my favourite. I'm still trying to get one of these Lego models made because I think that would be great on the shelf. I love the Lego. But again, the key point is there are phone apps for children for hand warmers, right? You can turn your phone. There's an app that will turn your phone into a hand warmer. And all it's doing is causing the electrolytes to race through the separator to warm the phone up and the battery up. And you think, there's a really clever idea. Yeah, sensible. And there's a sleep app for children on the phone that registers their sleep. But you put it under your pillow while it's charging. But then there's no way of anticipating heat. So there's a lot of things we're still learning about. And the key takeaway for me is that electric vehicle fires are rare. The cars themselves, they are rare when there's a fire, but when there is a fire, we all know about it. And it doesn't have to be the EV that starts the fire. The EV involved in the fire can cause the same problem even if it wasn't the starting thing. But again, I was asked this question the other day. When was the last time, how were they rated compared to internal combustion engine cars? When was the last time you saw a fire in an internal combustion engine reported in the news? It's about the same as when you hear about an EV reported in the news. Both vehicle fires are rare. We all drive different vehicle types. They are both rare. But responding to an internal combustion engine car, you've normally got between 12 and 15 minutes because the fire starts in the engine bay, usually because it's electrical where the fuel is, and the fuel tank, which is the main fuel source, is at the opposite end of the vehicle. A fire in an EV is generally the battery, which is your main fuel source. So a couple of minutes compared to 15 minutes means the ship's crew, in theory, have got a lot more time on an internal combustion engine car to respond. But with an EV, you don't have that time. And we've got to, the whole point of this is about trying to educate people to rethink their response, rethink how do you get people away, rethink what the consequences are. If there's a fire in a space where you've got EVs, can you flood it? Can you not? On a Ro-Ro, it's unlikely, but you might be able to cover it to buy yourself more time. And that's where we're going. So at that, I think we're concluded, and hopefully we haven't scared people too much. This is about learning and education and seeing where we go from there. And we've rattled through that a little bit longer than we planned, but it's pretty good.
That was excellent. I'd encourage people to start opening microphones, and we'll have a question, hopefully answer session now. I'll kick it off. I come from Ro-Ro background. As these EVs, don't carry vast numbers of them, as have been on Felicity Ace and Fremantle Highway, but the danger now is that EVs are aging. So the potential threat is changing and under-researched, isn't it? Where do you see us going with the developing risk?
Well, it's different. It's difficult to say because what we're looking at now may not be what we're going to be looking at in a year's time with regards to that. So until that's published or made in place, these batteries, we can start looking at them, seeing if there's any risks. There's lots and lots of money going into research into these batteries to try and, like I said, make them safer. But we're not really sure what we're looking at the moment. It's not as if the battery or EV manufacturers are happy to divulge their secret stuff behind their batteries.
And the difficulty is every manufacturer has a totally different set of standards, and the isolation on that vehicle may not be available to us. Only the professional fire brigades would be aware of how to isolate the battery. So all we can do is contain as best as possible, I suppose.
Well, that's the big thing. That is the big thing. We're in that learning phase at the moment. And while the technology is improving on a daily basis and the manufacturers themselves are looking to improve and make everything safer, there's already 1 million cars plus on the roads that haven't got that safety features built in. And a key point that I've always said, and what I would love to see, is that every ship has an AIS system. And I'd love every car to have a similar AIS that tells you if there's a battery problem. That'll never, ever happen because every manufacturer that's got that system, if his car says that's us, it's me, I started the fire that burnt the car park down, they're in difficulty. So the challenge is always going to be is we're in that learning phase now as we go forward. And there's examples out there where the technology we're not ready for the technology yet. So a story I heard the other day, which I thought was amazing, was I believe France invested in a load of electric vehicles as taxis, but the range was relatively short and they were recharging 2 to 3 times a day. And the batteries they had in them only lasted around 2 years. before they stopped recharging, and then the range got him as well. There are a couple of fields outside Paris full of these electric vehicles because they can't reuse them, and it's cheaper to buy a new one than it is to replace it. And we're in that world of pain at the moment where we're learning. And I did a search 2 days ago. I'm looking for a new car, and I'm looking for a 4x4 with 200 brake horsepower, and all the cars that come up now are 1 or 2 year old electric vehicles that people are trying to get rid of for less than £20,000. That are 40 or 50,000 pound cars, because they've either tried to do a long distance or they can't get there. And I can't believe where we are, because the insurance is high and it's crazy. But there's a whole world of trying to work out where we go from it. But we're learning. They're doing tests. And one of the tests that I know a manufacturer is doing now is if there's a fire in a vehicle here, what happens to the one directly above it if it's a deck and the deck's thin canopy? And they said, we don't know. We don't actually know what they're because we've never been asked to test for that. They'll tell you it's 2,700 degrees. And I have seen a video where a fire blanket on a car, can't remember the model of the car, but the fire blanket, there were 6 firefighters stood on the blanket and the flames were lifting the blanket off the deck. So we're still learning. We're in that phase of learning and trying to get through it. And that for me is the key thing. We're still trying to, if we don't understand, but they're in amongst us every day, we're on the back foot. And for seafarers, we're raising this as a profile in these presentations to think about what would the consequences be if an EV or a lithium-ion battery was on a deck in the space on your ship, be it a scooter in a cabin, be it anything you want to put, it could be anything. What would the response be? What would your risk assessment?
Can I just come back? That was a fire blanket on a vehicle, and the gases were expanding so much that the blanket was being displaced. Yeah. So a blanket has no value in certain circumstances. Then
depends how big the blanket is and how small the car is.
Yeah.
If you can get enough weight, and the blankets they're not light, as in 25 to 35 kilos.
Yeah.
But if you've got an open car deck space, there was a video, a photograph in there of 6 firefighters on a PCTC couldn't get the blanket over the car in the car deck because they couldn't get it to go down the sides of the car because there's only 15 centimeters between each vehicle.
Yeah.
So,
Really look at the time you're talking about to identify a fire starting, because on a ship you're not looking at the stuff, so that will happen. Then you've got your 5-10 minutes confusion. So at that point, it's too late almost. You can't send anybody in.
problem. Yeah.
And this is where, what are IMO doing about it? Are they just reluctant to look at it?
Yeah, IMO at the last SEC meeting in March, the presentations that were put forward were from effectively a manufacturer who was saying that the ship systems are perfectly fine. Don't worry about it.
I mean, this was a case of legislation as well. In 2007, 2008, the universities were talking about it, that nobody should ever own batteries and batteries should be a standard size. And you would just drive up to a petrol station and they would just swap out your batteries for you. You never own your batteries, and the state or legislation will own it.
I think Renault's got systems that way, and there's a Chinese manufacturer that's swapping batteries as well.
But the thing is, so another, I'm not sure of this, but one thing that I heard them say is, if you keep the battery between 50 to 80% charge, that, it has a much longer life cycle.
Yes.
Than,
Yeah.
So they just want to see, so you just drive up and keep swapping your batteries out, so you never run out of charge on a long drive. But it's an issue of regulation or legislation,
But storage of batteries, it's best in a cold environment, as in sort of Scandinavian countries. Then for use of batteries, it's best in a warm environment, as in sort of down Spain or something like that. So ultimately, they don't work, but
these engines have had heaters to start the engine all these years. So it's not we can do that, but it's just issue of nobody wants to legislate and everybody wants to have their own.
Yeah, as you say, the largest people are the exporters, the car manufacturers, so they're going to be dictating the policy, I suppose.
They want to play down any hazards, but there will be. We've had 2 major fires on PCTCs that have lost ships. I think we're going to potentially, hopefully not, but I would expect we'll see more when you start seeing second-hand vehicles being transshipped and moved. Because I think there'll be more, because there's no real defined check. You don't have to do a check.
And probably where it's more similar to us.
Yes.
Passengers, everything that comes on is second-hand car really for us.
But that's the point. They're second-hand vehicles, and that's where you've got to be careful, because particularly with the roads now, as the cars are much heavier, and they're bouncing through the potholes that are already there. And I've bounced through a few potholes today. Crikey, you're looking at the cobblestones between the tarmac that was 6 inches before. But you're bouncing through those things. But what does it need to do to cause a problem? And how many people have had a wee bump or a wee scrape in the car and thought, that'll be all right. You pull the bumper back out and you square it on. But actually that bumper's or the battery packs maybe had a little bit of a split and then water gets in there. Because you only need 1.5 litres of salt water to enter that battery to short circuit and put you in a thermal runaway. Because that's what one of the manufacturers did to start the thermal runaway process, 1.5 litres of salt water.
So going back then to the ship scenario with the drencher system, that would be salt water, of course. That's more hazardous ultimately than if we had infinite fresh water, which we don't.
No, but again, only if there's a leak into the battery. If the batteries are sealed,
right,
in theory, you should be fine.
Okay.
So it's only where you've maybe got a damaged battery that the water can get into. That's where the problem is. In theory, you think about it, it's like car tires. And we've had containers of car tires on ships, and they've said, they're total write-off because they've been in water. Well, why? Because that's what car tires do on the bloody road, for God's sake. Batteries are the same. These cars are designed to be safe, the water's going to be splashing up. You've got driving in Scotland with the
Tesla manual says do not
submerge.
Yeah.
That's the point. We're still in that learning phase, and they're still learning because most people design vehicles for not submerging them in salt water and for not being on a ship that's rocking about. The batteries there, the technology, there's people testing all the time, but we haven't really got all the answers yet. And I think that's the key thing. We are in that learning phase. And I think, as I say, as long as people are thinking about that learning phase and the consequences of what happens if one of these goes pop, and it could happen on the bridge of the ship as easy as it could happen on the car deck, as easy as it could happen in the engine room. Let's be honest about this. In fact, there was a YouTube video that came up on my phone yesterday, which caught me out. It was a flipping bodybuilder. You'll like this one. He had his phone on the floor next to where he was pumping his iron, and it was too weight, and he dropped it, and the weight dropped on his phone. And the phone went into thermal runaway because he'd crushed it, and it burst into flames. He picked it up, and he's throwing it around. But you don't actually know how dangerous those fumes are. If you're breathing that in, that's not because it's, crap, I bust my phone, and you get panicky. But actually,
could you relay the story, what you said before the meeting regarding how the investigators to this one suffered injuries from the inhalation of ducting?
This is so the crew on the Fremantle High were all hospitalised because of what they were breathing in during that process. The salvors were also hospitalised when they were on board because of what they were touching, the surface that they were touching. Because if you think about all the gases that are produced in a fire of any nature, because you get your plastics burning, you've got the gases and the toxics coming out of these lithium-ion batteries are on every surface, and there's particles suspended in the air. So unless you have fully protected your skin, I had skin burns from rubbing against items and rubbing against structures in that ship because we spent 6 weeks on board afterwards trying to sort a few things out. But the toxicity of the dust and the particles on that ship is also harmful for the house. So even though you might have had the fire and the fire's out and everything clear, that space is still toxic. The fire water had to all be removed off the ship because it was causing problems on the stability. But that also had to be recycled. You can't pump it underwater. And that was all being recycled. But again, with that water, we were still getting fumes off the water because of the toxins that were in it. It's a bit of we're in a different world of pain. And as the cars get more exotic and the materials are used to make the cars get more exotic, and a Mini, as I say, that body shell on a Mini is a lovely steel structure and it stayed looking like a Mini. The more exotic cars with the wood inside, some of those that are genuinely, there was a pile on the deck of ash with 4 brake discs. And that was all that was left on the deck because of the temperature that had been in that space. I've seen nothing like it, genuinely nothing like it.
What do you think the MCA are on? And it's not mentioned IMO. I think our biggest challenge is because we don't know those answers yet, and it's crew getting impatient. What are you going to do? What do we do? What equipment do we need? How do we fight it? And you're kind of like, I don't know, and so many people don't know, and it's.
I think the problem with the MCA is the MCA have to be 100% convinced about the route to take, sitting back a little bit to make sure that the route they go on, they're sitting on a knife edge at the moment, because if they go the wrong way and advise somebody the wrong way, which I think has already happened in certain circumstances, they could be prosecuted for giving guidance that's wrong. And this is where there's a bit of a disjoint, because I talk to the MCA quite a lot. Alan Love, based up Alan a lot, and we've given him the same presentation. And I sat down with him for 2.5 hours with Yvonne when we presented to him the findings from the Fremantle Highway and said, look, this happened. How do we make sure this doesn't happen and the crew are informed? And yeah, they don't know how to handle it. And I would say I always want to go with facts. That was a fact. That happened. You can't deny that was a case where we've had a major explosion and the crew followed all their procedures, but they weren't aware that there could have been a vapor cloud explosion. So I want everybody to be aware is you could have a vapor cloud explosion purely and simply because the gases could generate in vast quantities. And if they don't have the ignition source, then that cloud can develop, and then you ignite it with a 0.1 overbar pressure, it can blow bits apart or kill people.
Yeah.
And that's the bit. If you don't know, how do you prepare for it? So that's where we come from. We're about trying to get people prepared to think about it. So when they look at their own ship, because every ship is, we know every ship is different. It's not like a Boeing 737, which are all exactly the same. Every ship is different. Every sister ship has got a radar in a slightly different place and a different handle. That's the point. So you've got to look at your own ships. You've got to look at where your fire stations are. Is your fire station sufficiently safe if you're going to go into a car deck? Are they removed, or are they actually in the car deck? Because if they're already in the car deck, then you're already in a bit of a world of pain to start.
Well, that goes back to what you were saying is the design changes that may be required in the car carrier.
I think so. I think there's a lot of changes that we've got to think through. And there are companies at the moment, we're doing risk assessments with a few companies that are carrying EVs on container ships, and they're putting them in the top tiers of stone, because actually that's a way that's furthest away. But then that brings in a whole new world of pain, because if you get a fire in that, you can't put the fire out without monitors from a bridge wing. But all the fumes are going straight towards the bridge and the accommodation if you're moving through the water.
Yeah.
And if you're put it in a cargo hold, yeah, you might be able to flood it, but that's a different world of pain. Or do you flood the cargo hold in the ship? What does that do to your stability? What does that do to your structural strength? What do you do thereafter? And then somebody, we'll only put it 0.5 meter deep because that's where the flames could be. Okay, that's going to put free surface in place. Yeah. And I come from being a seafarer, trying to put solutions in place that people can then think about. If you think about a gas tanker or Chris's Sea Peak ships, I'm fairly certain the front bulkhead of that, or the accommodation block, is protected with extra thick steel or whatever it may be. So in the event of a fire at the forward part of the ship, the crew are protected. Very few other ships are. So if you had a fire on that foredeck, generally you can get into the accommodation fairly quickly, and then your safety's gone. And where are the lifeboats? The lifeboats are by the accommodation. You get a fire in the decks where they're running forward. It's all the consequences of, okay, put your cars on an upper deck. Where's the hazardous cargo going to be stowed? On deck forward, okay. But you don't want anything going towards the accommodation, so you start backing into the wind. Now all your flames in your wind are going towards where the hazardous cargo is. So it's about looking at everything in the round without overly scaring the crew. But it's not about scaring the crew. It's about a crew member. If you tell them what the consequences could be of a fire involving a lithium-ion battery, and say, right, okay, if you overheat that and it goes into thermal running, this is what it looks like. You need to think about evacuating the space, doing what you can to then contain it and ask for advice. But if you don't tell them there could be a vapor cloud explosion or a collection of toxic gas, or what they see if it's white smoke is harmful to your health, and you just assume they know. My concern is asbestos. How long did asbestos run for with claims and insurance? Years and years and years. If you have somebody on a ship that's breathed in this HF or breathed in these fumes, and suddenly a year or 2 years down the line, they develop cancer, lung cancer or throat cancer or something like that because of what they breathed in. That, to me, is the bit I want to avoid, which is why I'm going with the face masks as a protection. Because if you think about a face mask for €90 or €100 or whatever it is for the right things, in the grand scheme of things, it's small, like a life jacket. How often do you expect to use your life jacket on the ship? You wouldn't.
Never.
And that's the bit. It's about looking at everything.
One of the things there then is you're almost, you go back to the 80s, I think it's when they introduced the tanker safety officer course, the chemical tanker safety officer course. So with EVs, you're almost trying to raise awareness of those crew. But the problem is, one trip might be EVs, one trip might be regular cars or combinations thereof. But that could be one potential strand you can take to just enhance the training of the crew, cost and all the rest of that. But, you know, if you don't know, you don't know.
Well, that's the thing. And there are a lot of people that are training now and doing training on their ships, but they don't actually really fully understand the consequences, because the people that are telling them what the consequences are trying to downplay what the real consequences are. And that's the bit where we say, look, take a step back and look at it more holistically. We're used to worst case scenario. That's what we do for a living, is worst case scenario. And the stuff I attend is always worst case scenario. It's always bloody things that are blown up or whatever, run aground up a beach and you've got the world chasing you. But when you see that and you can see the consequences like the Fremantle Highway, if I hadn't raised the profile and tried to talk through with everybody to think these things through, and there's another accident, then I haven't done my job of due diligence to try and build the profile up. But until people learn or accept that this is a potential problem, and it is, but it might be very, very rare, like a ship running aground. You'd hope you'd never in your life run aground on a ship. I go to a bloody grounded ship most months with my career now, and you see it, but nobody's really prepared for it. But with an EV fire or a lithium-ion battery fire, the potential of what goes on, I think, is actually likely to get stronger and stronger, because it's only, 10 years they've been in your regular pocket now, in your phones. And one thing I will say, my wife, I've flipped shouted it a few times, but every mobile phone that she's ever owned is in a box in the loft, right? Every mobile phone. And I went up there and the NiCad batteries are all fine because they're still sat there looking good. But all the iPhones there with the backs that have now popped off because the battery's already started expanding. And I went, bloody hell, because it's undercharged. And it's one to think about. I've never considered before.
Does that affect so if you have an EV that's fully charged, is it going to burn for longer than a EV that's no charge in it? Does that affect the duration?
The state of charge is a question mark, because the lower the state of the charge, the less likely you have a fire to start with, but the more fumes you may generate before it fires off. So if you've got, like the videos we see with lots and lots of fumes, like the scooter one, all the fumes come out the battery and then there was a spark and it went bang. That's probably worst case scenario compared to a fully charged battery go straight to thermal runaway with a flame, because the flame is consuming the explosive gases. So it's the catch-22. The lower the state of the charge, the potential bigger problem you've got because of the vapor cloud.
Because of vapor.
Again, that's my thought process.
We were at a Scottish Parliament, and the CEO of CMMar, he was saying they wanted a number of ferries which were fully battery powered. What about something like that? Such a large battery on a vessel.
The vessel itself, rather than the electric, being the electric.
But I mean, because for this, I think the weight of the battery itself will be like 20% of the ship. Yeah,
but they're designed in spaces generally that you can flood with water. Or they're designed with cooling systems. They're designed with. They're actually built in. They're not. It's a different concept. And that's the thing. It's like the trucks. I know there's Volvo trucks now that are flipping a gigawatt of power in the trucks for the range they need to get out of them. But again, it's everything's evolving and getting bigger and stronger, and the whole time. Oh, that's great. Let's. The example I would give is for some of these battery energy storage systems, it's like a server rack, and in that server rack, what they've done is they've shoved a battery module into the server rack, and then each time, I could get more power, so they just tag a bit more on and you put more of these in. If you twist that unit and those racks aren't secured, and they all start dropping and the buzz bars all start falling to bits and you start thermal runaway, It's because they're not designed to go on ships, but we're carrying them on trucks. And therefore, you're talking bigger and bigger storage. That if there's a fault through no cause of your own, just either perhaps because you've lashed it in accordance with what you need to on the back of a Maffei trailer, but the centre of gravity and you roll and everything starts moving, we're still learning, aren't we?
Can I at this point ask Chris, who's hosting a CPIC, to open up to our external people? Any questions? Anybody got a question on the microphone from outside this room, please?
What?
You've answered everything already.
I was waiting one from Matt or Les. They're usually good for a question. Or Peter.
Anybody awake?
Yeah, Peter's there.
Yeah, but you've answered all my questions already. I like the assortment you've done.
Les,
and I
can you
was
turn
very interested in the
sorry, can you turn your...
the future construction of the batteries.
There we
I
go.
think that's something to look forward to, and also the undercharging, shall we call it, of the gases coming out when you recharge it. I must keep chasing my wife up because she lets her iPhone go flat. Thank you for that. I'll leave it for somebody else now. Go on.
Thanks, Lois.
Okay, mate.
It was good to get the battery piece out on. I think this is where we do it. Somebody said to me the other day, "Where's the instructions for the masters what to do?" And it's we never say exactly what to do with a fire because you need to decide there with the knowledge. But it's finding more ways.
But very importantly, we have an instruction: do not offer any charges. There is no recharging possible. Unlike your solicitor friend in the car park, plugging in with B&Q leads, whatever. But that includes, I've even stopped people from bringing a removable pedal cycle bicycle battery up into a passenger area to try and plug it into a 3-pin plug, and I've stopped that.
It's been our big concern. It's the less regulation around
They're more likely. Fire because they're less regulated.
Made in the Far East in a less regulated manner, yes. But
they're your Amazon from AliExpress and fill your boots. Because you don't know how it's been constructed.
Yeah.
And where it's coming. That's the big thing. But also with the scooters. And I was in London. I was at an arbitration in London and watching the children that had rented the electric scooters were doing stunts, doing Kirby's as they called them, sliding down on the battery pack, on the curbs. And you think, this is fun.
Hardcore enthusiast.
Hardcore enthusiast, but it is. It's
fly a long way.
oh, who's got a hand up? Anyone else? Who's that, Chris?
Someone's got a hand up.
Leah.
Oh, Peter.
Leah, on you go. Just turn your camera on and turn your mic on.
Yeah, good evening. Thank you so much for the presentation. I'm not Leah, I'm her husband. So
sorry, it's your name that's attached on Teams.
We're both
Weekend.
yeah, we're both here.
We're both mariners.
Yeah. So I've been working on ro-ro ferries as well in the Baltic Sea, and since the Scandinavian countries are very much pushing ahead with the e-mobility, we always had customers asking if they could charge their vehicles on board the ferry, and we were always debating if this would increase the risk of having such an event of a fire, and especially since we don't know their charging equipment. Do you have any recommendations in this direction?
I think my recommendation was to continue what you're doing now, because until we know for certain that it's safe to plug it in on the ship, it's a potential. And for me, any potential risk causing a fire is one that you don't want to run with on a ship, because again, it's that whole concept of how do you fight it if it starts.
Yeah.
So my view is that if something needs charging on the ship because you brought it in a dilapidated state, then actually no, you don't plug it in, because again, it's those consequences where you're. And I was just thinking back, I travelled over to Dublin a while back. I won't say the ferry company, but there was a woman whose car, she just made it to the terminal. It was a Tesla, just made it to the terminal, and the battery was saying it's in red. It was almost flat, and she was desperate to charge it up, and they charged it up on the crossing, but a wander lead through a fire door and plugged it into a 3-pin socket on the ship. And it gave her an extra 4 miles of range so she could get to a charging station when she got to the other side because of the shortness of the crossing. And I went, what was the point? There's no logic to me in doing that because the battery is low. And I think until we know more and until you take that consequence of if there is a fire in that vehicle while you're charging it, you can't respond to it. We can't respond to it because we're still learning what the consequences are. So my view is that for on ships, for the time period that's being carried on the ship, an hour or 2 hours or 6 hour crossing perhaps, you're not going to get much of a charge into it. You might be 10 or 15, possibly 20 miles on a standard 3-pin socket. What's the point? I personally, I would say until we know more, we're better off saying, look, charge in the port, either end, but don't do it on a ship.
Fine, door open. Well, another hand up there?
Yeah,
Pete, please.
Nope.
Hello, Peter.
Just trying to get my camera to come. Anyway, one of the issues that these electric batteries, these lithium batteries, is that by the time they get to a hysteresis level of about 80%, they're generally considered to be exhausted. That happens at about with repeated charging and discharging over 4 or 5 years. So once you get in a situation where it will only take 80% of its maximum charge, that the recommendation is that they're replaced. There's now a move afoot with some manufacturers to reissue these batteries with only 80% capacity, and you buy them knowing that. What's your opinion with regard to that endeavour?
Charging to 80%, is that what it's saying?
Second hand.
So the second hand ones, Peter, yeah?
Yes, second hands. Basically, they're replaced when they will only charge to the maximum of 80%. And they're talking about reconditioning them and reselling. So we've only got an 80% maximum volume. Now, to my mind, that means there's been a chemical degradation within the battery itself. Therefore, my perception is that they're already at higher risk when they're moved on to a new owner, a new buyer.
I mean, I think for me, with the secondhand batteries, you just never know where it came from and what it was involved in. Maybe it was taken from a vehicle that was, involved in a collision before, and they're just recycling it. It's not a risk that I would take, just because I don't really know the history of it. It is a difficult decision to make. For me, it's not something that I'd like to risk, not knowing the history of the battery itself.
I would be the same. I don't think that reconditioning of these batteries is sensible, because even if it's 80%, then you're talking 20% at the lower end. You're only looking at a sort of a 60% capacity battery, and the value of that, I think, is limited. I can see the logic if you're going to use it for like a storage system, potentially, that you're going to have sat in an outside shed somewhere for solar panels or something like that, where you don't need it. But I certainly wouldn't be looking at for any form of mobility where you are looking to recharge it and discharge it and recharge it, discharge it in a normal cycle. I think that's where it could be quite seriously dangerous.
Thanks for that.
Good question, I want to think about. Yeah.
The other issue there is that you don't know how many times it's been recycled. And I think that's quite a serious point. And, it's really interesting what you're saying about the dendrite production within inside it. You've no idea to what level the dendrites have grown.
Yeah.
And they reach a critical stage, and when they go, they go.
Mm-hmm.
There's no stopping it. Thanks for that.
Thanks, Peter. Okay, next up, in order of hands, Jafari.
Good evening, Captain Adrian and Adrian. Many thanks for informative presentation. I would like to add that second-hand EVs are widely loaded by the container vessel, also especially exporting from the China. And so this is the main challenges, which is, I think, the future we have to, I think it's better be added to our presentation. I also have a question from the Captain Adrian regarding that as a SCR of the salvage operations. Captain, what was the main challenges the tugboat firefighters encountered during the salvage operation of the firefighting operation in the Fremont highways, in terms of the effectively deliver the water to the main source of the fire inside the car carrier? Because as I've seen the shell pelleting of the Fremont, it is a significant destruction damage, and I think the tugboat firefighter could only carry out the boundary cooling, so they could not. How you brought the water inside the vessel? For the container vessel, it is open space, so it is possible tanker vessel. But what about the PCTC?
It's a very good question, and what you'll note from the videos and the photographs of the Fremantle you can see online is the salvors following the explosion stopped boundary cooling very quickly, because with the explosion it opened holes in the deck, and what they didn't want to do was put water into that ship they couldn't then control with a free surface effect. So the boundary cooling was purely on the sides, but again, there was cracks in the sides where they didn't want to put water in. They could cause a boundary cooling, a free surface problem. And in the end, on the Fremantle, I would say lucky is not the right term for it, but we were lucky in that the fire got very intense very quickly without water slowing it down, and the vehicles burnt out. You could see there's a trail where the fire was burning through the deck, but it didn't actually burn through below the freeboard deck. It didn't go. There were spots where it had, and paint had detached into the lower deck, but it hadn't spread to any vehicles. And had it gone below the freeboard deck, that's when I think there would have been a bigger problem. But the salvors on that one, because everybody was off and safe and the ship was under tow and under control, they actually let it burn. And they were sailing it under control of tugs upwind. The tugs were upwind, and they sailed it and controlled it that way to stop putting any further water in it, and it burnt itself out, which I think actually probably why we had the evidence we did afterwards to look at it, because obviously the Felicity A sank, she lost stability and sank. This one, she stayed up, and I think it's because of less water put into her. So it's a good point, and you just can't on those. I think that's what it'll be a luck, and it was on the Fremantle. The salvors were there, they had it under control, and they would have done something with it, but it didn't spread.
All right, thanks. Okay, back to northern Germany, Bailing. I'm not going to call them the.
Yeah, thank you. Another question regarding the practice on board, because as we've seen very impressively in these videos, that the fumes are developing very quickly. Would you say that running continuous ventilation would decrease the risk of ignition of the vapor cloud, or would you say it happens so fast that it doesn't make any difference?
The question for me would be, how do you vacate any fumes in the cardiac space? So if you've got a supply and extraction system, will the supply blow the fumes from that car deck without needing the extraction fans? Because if the extraction fans are there, they could ignite the fumes if they're not intrinsically safe fans. So yes, we've got a vent, but how do you vent? If you can naturally vent the fumes out by supply air venting off a car deck or venting out through vents, that might work. But again, where are they venting and where is the fire? So when you're venting, because you're now supplying air into a fire, which could actually make it more intense. But again, to clear the clouds, that's a positive thing. But where will those fumes vent out? And certain times, as we know, you've got the vents will extract from the bottom of a car deck and it'll pull it out. But if you're pulling it out, you could actually ignite the flames if there's a vapor cloud. So this is the question we would say to ships and ships' crews: look at your systems. Can you vent by just blowing an air out? But where does those fumes go? Yeah. And if you can only extract, where are you extracting to? What again? This is a ship by ship. It's a company by company way of doing things. But what you don't want to do is extract over a fan, because even a static charge could ignite the cloud. So that's a good question. And again, this is one we're still trying to answer ourselves.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
No problem, sir.
Matt?
Yeah, evening all. Nice boots, Adrian. The deep sea pilots. I know there was a deep sea pilot on the Fremantle Highway. Have they inquired about anything? Would you recommend that they carried one of the respirators you're talking about if they go back on a car carrier?
My gut feeling, Matt, and I know we've talked about this a fair bit, would be, if you've got to look at this, is that the deep sea pilot is a one-man band going on a ship, and he'll have his life jackets, he'll have his hard hat, he'll have all his PPE. And I personally would say, yes, that's something that I would be carrying if I was going on board as a safety protection thing, because again, with the face masks that we're looking at, the Draeger ones and everything else, it's like a BA set, and therefore they fit your face. So in an emergency, you want something that you've already got preset, pre-rigged. You know how it fits. I would go with my own, as they do with the PPE, the what do you call it, the pilot things, the PPUs or whatever they are, portable
PPUs.
pilot units.
Portable pilot.
And it's having, you've got to look after yourself in this, because I don't think we're going to convince shipping companies in the main to install or give everybody a face protection. And therefore, in the event of that case, that deep sea pilot, had he had his own, he may well have protected himself a lot longer than everybody else and not suffered as much. So I would say yes, and they're not expensive, Matt. And I think we should. I know when I'm going places now, and any SCR job I go, and Yvonne's just been out and done a job herself, we carry those filtration face masks with us now on any job where we think there might be a battery involved, because we want to make sure we're protected and we're safe, and we carry Tyvek suits in our bags, and we've got all that we're now carrying all the correct PPE purely and simply because we don't know, and you can't rely on the ships having the equipment.
Have you had any approach from like you said, there's 2 companies in the UK that supply deep sea pilots. Have you had any contact with them? Because it was a British deep sea pilot, wasn't it?
It was a British deep sea pilot, yeah, Matt. No, we haven't. But again, as you know from our discussions, we've done this presentation probably 30 or 40 times now, and each time we do it, it's to a different audience. So that might be something, Matt, we need to touch base on.
I can. Yeah, no, leave it with me. Yep. That was just a thought. So
happy to speak to anybody on this, because the more we promote it with respect to its safety, not hazard, it's how people learn to protect themselves. So yeah, happy to help with that, Matt.
Yeah. All right. Appreciate it. Thanks very much, Adrian. Cheers, gents.
Good. Yeah. So, Matt, are you happy with that?
Yes, absolutely.
So no more questions. We'll say thank you very much to everybody for the room, and hopefully it's been of interest. And myself and Yvonne, we can be contacted. If anybody wants the presentation in a PDF format, we can share that around. Not an issue. But if there are any questions, then do feel free to give us a shout, either through the Central Scotland branch or direct through ourselves. We're happy to take questions. And we've got a team of 5 of us, 6 of us, with the naval arcs as well, that are looking at this all the time. So happy to help.
Thanks very much indeed. It's been great. Yeah.
Okay, I've just learned from Chris that this presentation, all hour and a half of it, whatever it is, has been recorded. So we may even be able to put it online at some point.
Perfect.
I'll liaise with Central Nautical Institute as well, maybe for wider learning.
Absolutely. Perfect. We're happy to.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, for those that want it, you'll find the recording should be in the chat, but I'll send it around if you want it.
Thanks for what you did.
Or rather, I know someone that will.
That's right.
We need a secretary.
Brilliant. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. And thanks for everyone for attending.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah. Thanks, Adrian. Thanks, Mark.